Hi everyone, Mr. Tobin here again, and in this video we are going to look at Paul Durcan's poem, Wife Who Smashed Television Gets Jail. This poem is on for both higher and ordinary levels, so make sure to download the appropriate worksheet from the link in the description. So first we'll look briefly at some background to the poem, then we'll go through line by line, and finally we'll look at some really interesting ideas that you can talk about in your essays if a question on Durcan comes up. There's a few interesting points to make before we look at this poem that may help our understanding of it. Firstly, there's Durcan's own attitude to TV. Durcan has said previously that he believes both radio and television can be useful for artistic expression. Durcan is a great lover of cinema and other visual arts such as painting, and he sees very little difference between these arts and poetry. On the other hand, we can definitely agree that this is not how television is presented in this poem, and in an interview with the Irish novelist Tobin, he talks about the guilt that he feels when watching television, particularly when watching Sky News. His relationship to TV is conflicted then, and perhaps it is more what is consumed rather than the television itself, the programme that is being watched, rather than the box in the corner. Durcan is well known for critiquing Irish society and the hypocrisy of conservative or traditional institutions, and this comes to the fore in this poem as well. Finally, it's worth remembering that Durcan's own father was a circuit court judge, and Durcan didn't have a particularly good relationship with him. Perhaps there is some crossover here in the presentation of the judge in the poem. For more detailed information on Durcan, take a look at my Introduction to Paul Durcan video. The link is in the description below. So let's begin by reading through the poem together. She came home, my lord, and smashed in the television. Me and the kids were peaceably watching Kojak when she marched into the living room and declared that if I didn't turn off the television immediately, she'd put her boot through the screen. I didn't turn it off, so instead she turned it off. I remember the moment exactly because Kojak, after shooting a dame with the same name as my wife, snarled at the corpse, "Good night, Queen Maeve." And then she took off her boots and smashed in the television. I had to bring the kids round to my mother's place. We got there just before the finish of Kojak. My mother has a fondness for Kojak, my lord. When I returned home, my wife had deposited what was left of the television into the dustbin, saying, "I didn't get married to a television, and I don't see why my kids or anybody else's kids should have a television for a father or a mother. We'd be much better off all down in the pub, talking or playing bar billiards." Whereupon she disappeared off back down again to the pub. Justice O'Brodick said wives who preferred bar billiards to family television were a threat to the family, which was the basic unit of society, as indeed the television itself could said to be a basic unit of the family. And when, as in this case, wives expressed their preference in forms of violence, jail was the only place for them. Leave to appeal was refused. Okay, so we're going to break it down and look at the first 6 lines together. She came home, my lord, and smashed in the television. Me and the kids were peaceably watching Kojak when she marched into the living room and declared that if I didn't turn off the television immediately, she'd put her boot through the screen. I didn't turn it off, so instead she turned it off. The poem is framed like a court report in a newspaper. The headline is exactly what we would expect to find in a newspaper, and the opening of the poem is a direct quotation from the husband, addressing the judge, my lord. The she here is his wife. In the second line, the speaker groups himself with the children, me and the kids. It's also interesting that he uses the word peaceably to describe how they were watching the television. It's the use of casual, everyday language that really draws the reader into the narrative of the poem, but the word peaceably sticks out. Perhaps he is trying to get on the judge's good side or trying to impress him. The word peaceably is also in stark contrast with the verbs used to describe the wife's actions. She marched and declared. The picture painted here is of a wild woman bursting in on this peaceful domestic scene, shouting and roaring. There's more colloquial language. Colloquial language is everyday, ordinary language. When he says she'd put her boot through the screen. Here the speaker is presenting the wife as a terrorizing force. She's threatening violence. Eventually, we are told she does exactly what she threatened to do, and she puts her boot through the television screen. The program that the speaker and the kids are watching, by the way, is the American detective show Kojak, which was hugely popular in the 70s. As we saw in the context and background at the beginning, Durcan may be criticizing what they are watching rather than the actual television itself. Kojak was aimed at an adult audience, and it delved into quite serious themes such as sexual violence and murder. It really wasn't intended for kids. Line 7 to 13. I remember the moment exactly because Kojak, after shooting a dame with the same name as my wife, snarled at the corpse, "Good night, Queen Maeve." And then she took off her boots and smashed in the television. I had to bring the kids round to my mother's place. We got there just before the finish of Kojak. My mother has a fondness for Kojak, my lord. Okay. The speaker goes on to tell the judge that he remembers the moment exactly, not because it would be unusual that his wife came into the house and kicked in the TV, but because it was the moment Kojak in the TV show shot a woman called Maeve, the same name as his wife. There's two things to consider here. Firstly, how appropriate is it that the children are watching this, but also that it's his reference point for something so serious and dramatic. It suggests that the TV and the program they watch on it are so deeply ingrained, so deeply connected to their everyday lives, that it becomes their reference point for significant events. It would be like saying, I remember when my little brother was born because it was right before the last episode of Game of Thrones. Again, the presentation of the wife is developed through the image of her taking off her boots and smashing in the TV. It's such a violent act that seems entirely uncharacteristic of a mother, with her children in the room in particular. Remember, we are only hearing one side of the story here though. Perhaps if the wife had leave to appeal, which we are told at the end she does not, we might hear a different story. The wife's behaviour is so shocking that the speaker has to take the children out of the house away from her, not for their own safety, but to catch the end of the programme in the speaker's mother's house. There's humour here in these lines as the speaker, with an aside, tells the judge that his mother too is a big fan of Kojak. The humour stems from how ridiculous the situation is. Lines 14 to 21. When I returned home, my wife had deposited what was left of the television into the dustbin, saying, I didn't get married to a television, and I don't see why my kids or anybody else's kids should have a television for a father or a mother. We'd be much better off all down in the pub, talking or playing bar billiards. Whereupon she disappeared, off back down again to the pub. Again, in this line, we have an unusual and slightly jarring word that seems to be there to impress the judge. The speaker says that his wife had deposited the TV in a bin rather than thrown it in the bin or put it in the bin. There's a sense of a growing understanding between the speaker and the judge. They're both male, and there's an unspoken connection between them at the expense of the speaker's wife. In these lines too, we hear the wife's voice for the only time, albeit through her husband. And what she has to say is that she didn't marry a TV and she doesn't want her kids or anybody else's kids to be raised by a TV. Here perhaps she is voicing Durcan's own concerns of the role that television is playing in the family and in society. Nowadays, of course, we know all about the problems of overexposure to screens, about blue light stopping people from sleeping properly. But in the 70s, when they knew none of that, the concern was about how people would interact with each other and talk to one another when they were sitting in silence staring at a box. There's an interesting comparison too raised by the wife when she says that they would all be better off down in the pub than at home watching TV. Now this is Durcan's playful side. In the 70s and earlier, there would have been a social stigma about women in pubs, and even now there is about people who spend a lot of time in pubs. As a society, we would accept that pubs are not places for children, especially at night time or after a certain hour. Yet here is a mother saying that her children would be better off down in the pub talking and playing bar billiards, which is a type of snooker, than being at home watching TV. The last line here is quite a telling one. The wife disappears down to the pub again. The suggestion being that she spends too much time there and is rarely home. But remember, this is the suggestion coming from the husband. Okay, lines 22 to 26. Justice O'Brodick said wives who preferred bar billiards to family television were a threat to the family, which was the basic unit of society, as indeed the television itself could be said to be a basic unit of the family. And when, as in this case, wives expressed their preference in forms of violence, jail was the only place for them. Leave to appeal was refused. So here the focus shifts from the husband giving evidence to the judge giving his verdict. The judge's name being an Irish, O'Brodick, could hint that this is the Irish establishment verdict, not just his own one. He says that wives like this one were a threat to the family because they preferred bar billiards to television. He goes on to say that the television is a basic unit of the family. Now this is where Durcan's critique comes to the fore. A representative of the Irish establishment, the upper echelons of a male-dominated society, is declaring that the television is a basic unit of the family, as opposed to a mother or a father, and that a mother who, we must remember, has simply broken her own appliance in her own home, a mother who expresses their preference in forms of violence, should go to jail. The final line of this poem is phrased exactly as you might find it in a news report. Leave to appeal was refused. But behind this language lies a whole host of meanings. The wife is not allowed challenge the decision. She is not allowed challenge the verdict. She is not allowed challenge the sentence. Durcan here, in these 5 short words, presents almost a history of the oppression of women in Irish society. A woman who, in her own words, does not want her children raised by a television, sitting in silence, staring at a box, and instead wants them to have real conversations with real people and engage with other people, is deemed a danger or a threat to the family unit. Her voice is not heard in the court, it's simply mediated through her husband. She's marginalised, isolated, blamed, and finally removed from the picture. Okay, so some poetic techniques that we can discuss in relation to this poem. The form of this poem is key. If you've studied the poem Nessa, or The Difficulty That Is Marriage, you'll notice there's a very different tone in those poems. And the tone in this poem comes from the form that it's written in. It's written to mimic a news report from the courts. From the title, like a newspaper headline, to the direct quotations and the judge's verdict, it all has the style of a report. This creates humour because we wouldn't really expect to read a report like this. It's ludicrous, really. But the ridiculous nature of it is what Durcan uses to offer his critique of Irish society. The husband and the judge, two men, seem to know what's best for the family unit and do not even invite the wife to speak or defend herself. The language used by the speaker to ingratiate himself with the judge is made intentionally obvious to the reader, and the judge's lack of questioning, of probing and sense paints him as simply a representative of an unsympathetic state, not a real person in his own right. Perhaps, as we said at the beginning, there may be some parallels here with Durcan's own father. I hope that you found this video useful in your study of Durcan and his poetry. Please take a look at the channel for more, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to leave a comment, a suggestion, or a request, then please do.